So we're back. It's week 6. And today we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We started building our node application that was connected to our MongoDB. We had it reading some data out of the database. So today we're going to try and accomplish 4 things before we leave today. First thing we're going to do is we're going to try and add data to the database. Then we're going to do delete, update. The last thing I'm hoping that we have time to do is move our database off of our local MongoDB server onto a cloud service so that it's running online and it would then be accessible from, say, our Azure web server or our Heroku web server. Obviously, those remote servers are not going to be able to connect to a local database. They're going to need a database that's online. So we'll do that. I also just want to spend a minute, but not much longer, talking about next week's class. So next week's class is your midterm exam. We'll start right at 8 o'clock, so you want to try to be here on time to give yourself the most time possible. Okay, there's 2 parts to the exam. Part 1 is question and answer, and part 2 is a practical section where you'll have to build something with Node. Each section of the exam is weighted equally, so they're 10% of your final grade each. The exam is open book. And what I mean by open book is you will be allowed to use any of your own files. You can use a textbook if you have one, and you can use anything on Blackboard. That's it. Okay. The idea, and I had this issue last time I taught this course, I made very clear that you could not take my GitHub repos, download them, and change the words and give them back to me and ask me to mark them. I had 2 students do this. How did I know? Because I put additional comments in my repositories that I know where those comments are and you don't. And it's really easy if I see those comments in your exam files, then I know they're really not your files. You've just taken my repositories and added or changed things. That's not the idea of the exam. Okay, I'm not going to mark your changes to my files. So please don't do this, because yes, I will make comments in there somewhere that you will not see, and I will. Okay. And if I have issues with this on the midterm, well, then I'm going to rethink doing open book exams in the future, and we'll just make them closed where you have to remember everything, which is not my preference. But and the YouTube screencasts are off limits. You can't have your headphones and be watching the class lessons during the exam. Yes, I did have people ask me this already, if they could watch the lessons during the exam. No, you have to watch the lessons before the exam. So you have the full 2 hours, 50 minutes until starting at 8 and going until 10:50 next week. When you're done the exam, you're free to go. Okay, this is your only exam in this course. There is no final exam. You're doing presentations instead. The end. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the midterm? Wolfgar?
Do we have music logging out?
No. No headphones, no phones, no music. Because I have no way of knowing that someone's music isn't a Node.js podcast, for example. Right? Or that if I allow it, then people could easily watch the screencast and watch the lessons, right? There's really no way for me to police that effectively. So the easiest way is to say no. Other questions? Okay, I think I have almost everyone's portfolio submission. There were 1 or 2 I'm still waiting on. I will start marking them, so I will definitely have them marked before your test next week, so you'll know what your mark is. If you're one of the few who hasn't submitted yet, please make sure you submit by tonight to get the most possible marks. Okay, so what I want to do is pick up where we left off last week. So I'm going to go into my Node folder. And I'm just going to take my lesson 5 application, make a copy of it, and then rename that copy to lesson 6. It's kind of big. It's about 11 megs, so it'll take a minute. While this runs, we can also open a couple of command prompts. We're going to need 2 of them. In one command prompt, we'll use to launch our local instance of MongoDB, so our database server is running, and then we'll use the other command prompt to run the node application. So I'm just going to rename lesson 5 to lesson 6. And I'll open up my lesson 6 project in my code editor. Project from last week. I'm just going to make a couple changes. X.js, when we load the home page, it has a title of lesson 5 and it says CRUD with MongoDB part 1. I'm just going to change that. It's lesson 6. It says part 2. That's it. Now we should be able to run the application, but our application, the first thing it does when it kicks off, it tries to connect to MongoDB. So if MongoDB is not running and I try to start my node application, I'm going to get an error. If I use nodemon, it's going to start, but it's trying to connect to my local database server, which is offline. So in this command prompt, I need to browse into my node MongoDB folder that we created last week after we downloaded and installed MongoDB, and we copied those files in here. Anybody remember the command we need to use to launch the database server?
Like MongoDB.
Yep. We need to run the command MongoD, and we're going to specify the DB path. Space minus DB path. And then we're setting up the path. We created a data folder inside our node directory last week. And inside of data, we had a blank directory called DB. That's where Mongo will store our databases. So we need a space after the command MongoD, and a space after the word minus DB path. And now if I kick that off, my server should start. So I will restart my web application. My MongoDB command prompt is telling me there's now an open connection, so I should be able to load up our site from last week. Now it runs. I've just changed my title and content, and we have our liquor store, right? Our data's coming from our MongoDB now that our MongoDB is back online. So we're pretty much right where we left off last week. So we've done one of the 4 CRUD operations here. We're reading data out of MongoDB, but we can't modify it in any way. We can't add, we can't delete, we can't update. So we want to do all those things today. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put a link on this page that says add a drink, and that'll take us to a view, which will just be basically a plain HTML form. And we'll have inputs for these 4 values. Then we'll need to write some code in our index.js that will process that form when it's submitted back to the server. So let's start. I'll just close all these files up. So the first file we want to start with is our drinks.ejs. So here is our page that looked a lot like our PHP page to display a table of data. Here on line 4, after I have the title and before we display the data, I'm just going to put on a standard HTML link tag. So this is going to go to drinks/add. Our link will just say add a drink. If I refresh my page in the browser and click on that, what's going to happen? If I go click that new link, Jesse? Yeah, so what are we going to get as a response? You got it, right? So if we run it now, we should get 404. We're linking to a page that we don't have. That's okay. That's what we expect to get. So now let's go and create our page. There's not going to be any JavaScript on it. It's just going to be a plain HTML form. So we'll build a basic form and then we'll add Bootstrap for some styling. So inside of my views, we'll create a new EJS file. We'll call it add drink. How much of this HTML code template do we need in this file? Do we need all of it? No, how much of it do we need? Right, what are we going to replace this with? Right, so we'll include our header at the top from partials. And then I'll just copy that, paste it. We'll put on a heading. It says drink details. And now we're going to need an HTML form with some inputs and a submit button. We'll add a form. Now, when we built forms with PHP, we usually specify 2 properties of the form. What 2 properties are we, Wolfgar? Yeah, usually action and method. With our node forms, we're not going to use the action. We're going to omit it. If we don't include the action attribute, which page will receive the form submission? Where does it go if we don't specify an action? Okay, but if I leave out the action, user fills out the form and clicks the submit button, where does it go? Normally, when we specify the action, it goes to that page. If we leave the action out, what page loads? Nope, because app's not an actual page. The actual page that loads is the same page. Good answer, Shivam, right? The page will post to itself. We could have done that in PHP, but our code's really messy when we do that. in Node, it's actually cleaner to just let the page post to itself. So we're going to exclude, we won't even bother with the action. But we do want to specify the other attribute, which is the method. And once again, we want to use post. Why would we use post instead of get? What's the difference between a form get and a form post? Wolfgar?
Yeah, with your results of your form into the kernel.
You got it. So all of our form inputs wind up as query string parameters on the end of our URL. We don't see those with post. So we're going to want to use post. So we'll set up, I'll leave the classes out of it for now for styling. We'll just make sure our form loads properly, and then we'll use Bootstrap to format it. So we'll have a label for, now it was a week ago that we created the drink model. So I don't exactly remember what we called each property. If you want to know, look at our drink class, we can just go to models and open up the drink.js. And here's our definition of a drink. So we're going to want inputs. We actually have 5 inputs. Name. So name will be our first input, and that's going to be a text box. We'll have an input. We'll leave out any validation for now. We'll add some validation in a little bit. Then we have drink type. What kind of control should we use for drink type? Yeah, we probably want to use a drop down, and we can just hard code in some values for the drink type. We'll put on a select. And we'll just create some options here. So we've already got these 3 options, sangria, whiskey, vodka. So we probably want to include those. And we can maybe add a few others. Again, we don't have a separate drink type collection. There's no relationships here. We're actually going to store the full name of the drink nested inside each drink. Or we'll just leave it for now. Those are our 3 options. Anything else we add today have to be one of these 3. So now we've got we have size and we have units. We can probably put these on the same line, these 2 inputs beside each other. The size is probably going to be a text box. Now, what about the units? Should this be a drop-down or should it be a text box as well? Drop-down, okay. So let's put on select box for units. And what options should we put in there in terms of size? Well, these are the units. So milliliters would be one option. What other units might we find bottles of liquor in besides milliliters? Yeah, could be ounces, could be liters. Could be ounces, could be milliliters. Anything else we might find? Yeah, we'll probably best to stick with milliliters. So maybe we'll have ml. What do we have here? Yeah, just ounces or liters. Or ounces. And lastly, we need an input for the alcohol percentage. In this case, we're just going to want a text box. I mean, we could create a drop-down list with all the numbers from like 1 to 100. We'll just, I think for simplicity, have a text box. And then just before I close the form, I want a button that save. So our size and our units, those can appear right next to each other. The units doesn't need to be on a separate line because those two inputs are related. So we'll have 4 lines and then a button. So now we have our form. Should be functional this way. I will want to do a little bit of styling with it as well in a minute. Just go back to my browser, click on add. Now we still have a 404 error. How come? You're close, Mahesh. Where did we know? What are we missing? What file do we need to add to? So we need to, in our roots and drinks.js, we need a root handler, right? The application still doesn't know that the URL drink/add is supposed to load this EJS file. We need a root handler like you did in your lab, like you've done in your portfolio, that instructs the application to serve out this page when we get a request at drinks/add. So we're going to need to open up the drinks.js controller. We have one root handler here for our drinks page where we're processing a GET request. We now need get drinks/add where we'll show the blank form. We're going to run a request at /add. Remember, we don't need drinks as part of the URL because our app.js already maps any requests that start with drinks to this controller. So drinks is already understood that that's part of the URL from app.js. That already takes us in file. And then we have our callback. Now we'll just call res.render, add drink. We'll pass in a title that'll appear in the header. So this should make our 404 go away. And this should start to be familiar because you've been doing this. We've been doing this for 3 weeks now, and you've done it in lab, both in your family lab as well as in your portfolio to load your different views. So far if we go back and try our add drink link, our form should show up in the browser now. We'll just try mine. So now we get our form. So I want to add a few classes to it. I want to make all the labels the same width. That will make all of our inputs align. And I want to make the submit button green and have it aligned underneath all of our form inputs as well. The other thing we should probably do, someone in yesterday's class was complaining that it was bugging him too much that our footer's floating around up here, and he wanted us to suggested we anchor the footer down at the bottom, which is probably a good idea. So to anchor our footer down at the bottom, if we go into our partials and footer.ejs, we can just add a couple more bootstrap classes here. And then navbar dash fixed dash bottom. That'll route the anchor the navbar down to the bottom of the page. So I've added the 2 classes in blue. The alert info, we already had that from last week. So if you add those classes and refresh any of the views, it should move the footer down to the bottom of the page.
I got an error that says port 3000 is already in use when I did the last changes to our file there, the form.
Try stopping it in the command prompt and restarting.
Okay.
So now my footer goes down near the bottom. And now we just want to clean up this form. So I'll go back to addDrink.ejs. On my div tags, I'm going to add a class of form-group. So that's on my 4 divs. I'm just going to copy that tag to the opening div. All 4 of my sections. So the class is form-group. We'll attach it to each of those 4 div tags. That'll just add a little spacing, a little padding, make them the same size. I want to format the 4 label tags as well. Class. And these classes will be, I want to make them the same width, so I'm going to use call small 2. And also mark them as labels for controls. So again, I'm just going to copy this class definition from the first label. I'll copy it onto the other 3 labels. So there's a label here, and here, and here. By making the labels all the same width, the left edges of our input boxes are all going to line up. So if I save this, I'm almost done. Let's go back and check how our form looks, and I'll put our code back up. So notice we have a little padding here, things are aligned. My save button's still off over here and it's gray. So on my button, I want to style it with one of the Bootstrap button classes to make it green. And I also want it pushed over here, over to the right, so my button appears here lined up underneath my other inputs. So if these are 2 columns wide, I want to offset this button by 2 columns. Basically put 2 columns on the left side of the button. So we'll give this a class of button success, which will make it green. And we will offset this button by 2 columns. So there's 2 columns of padding on the left side. That's how wide all of our labels are. So now our button should appear directly underneath our inputs. This may trigger some vague memories for some of you because we use the same classes in our PHP forms to set them up. Refresh it. Now my button's green and it appears over here. So this form is done. We're not going to inject any JavaScript values here. All our formatting's done, and we have all 5 inputs that we need if we're going to add a new drink. Actually, I should say there is one other thing we're going to add. We won't do it yet. Soon we'll add some user validate, some input validation. Right now, I can just load this page, leave the whole form blank, and click the submit button, which we don't want users to be able to do. But I'll show you why we're going to do it that way first, and then we'll add our validation shortly. What happens if you click your submit button? What do you get? What's the error, Genevieve? Okay, can we be a bit more specific? What kind of error should happen if I submit the form now?
I think it will not give any error, it will just load the page.
Okay, well, try it. How come we got 404 not found? Look at the URL. It's going to drink/add. And didn't we just write the code that when we have a request at drink/add, we should load the form?
We have to like put it in the routes.
Okay, well, let's look for a minute. Here's our routes. We're handling drink/add and loading the view. So how come this works? Right, there's our URL. But at the same URL, how is it possible we get a 404 at the exact same URL we just loaded? John?
You're missing the post.
Thank you. So, Carrie, you're on the right track. We do need to add it to the routes, but so far we're only handling a GET request at that URL. So when we click the link, Node runs a GET. It displays the blank form. But remember, our form method is post. So now we're still getting an HTTP request at drink/add, but it's no longer a GET request. It's now a post request. And we haven't told our application how to handle a post. So now we need to handle instead of router.get, now we're going to use router.post. So the same URL, but it's a different type of HTTP request. If we were building the application the way we did it in PHP, this is where our code would go to process the form input, connect to the database, and insert the new data into the database. We don't need a separate page for that anymore with Node and Express. We just need a post handler. So we can process this same page in 2 different ways, when we're displaying the form or when we're processing a submission of the form. So we've done the first one, now we need to do the second one. So we basically need to do 3 things here. What 3 things should happen if we were going to kind of break this down, step 1, step 2, step 3? What do we want to do when our form is posted to the server?
Add data into database column.
Okay, that's probably the second that we do need to do that. That's probably step 2. What do we need to do maybe first? Nope. Mongoose does that automatically. Yeah, we probably want to get the data from the form. And then we're going to, we'll kind of do it in one step. Get the data from the form, send it to the database, and then what should we do? Where should we take the user? What should the user see in the browser? We have a couple of options. After we save the new document to MongoDB, we could show them a message, or what would the other option be? Yeah, after we add, we could just redirect them here, and that new drink should appear at the bottom of the list. So maybe we'll do it that way. We'll do a redirection. Okay, message would be fine, but probably they're going to want to see that updated list, so we'll just take them there. So we're going to need to use drink model that we created last week, right? So here's our models drink file. So we're creating a drink class of our own. It inherits from Mongoose schema. So any of the properties, methods that exist in a Mongoose schema, our drink class automatically inherits. So we use this for our drinks page, right? We have a global reference in this file to our drink model. And because our drink model inherits from Mongoose, Mongoose has a built-in find method that we can call. We didn't have to write our own find method. We're just calling the method that comes with Mongoose. So not only does Mongoose have a find method, it has functions for all of the CRUD operations. It has a create method, it has an update method, it has a delete method, it has a find by ID method. We're going to use all of those today in order to get a full CRUD module working. So here what we're going to do is get the form inputs and use Mongoose to insert to the database. So I'll use my drink model, and instead of calling the find method we call on our drinks page, we're going to call the create method. Just to repeat, we don't have to write this function. Create is built into Mongoose. So in here, we just pass in the properties. Now, if this is PHP, this is where we have to use that really messy syntax that I hate, $_post, bracket, quotes, and the name of our input. This is so much easier with Express. How do we get the name input? Request object, body, name. That's our equivalent of what in PHP would be $_post, bracket, quote, name. If we look at app.js for a minute, one of the things when we use the Express generator, one of the dependencies the generator has is called body parser. So body parser will automatically allow us to read form inputs using the request.body object. So now we specify the other 4 attributes the same way. And again, I've already forgotten the name, so I just go back to my model. It's drink type, request.body, drink type. Notice WebStorm recognizes that input when I hit request.body that actually comes up. Size. Units. But look how much less code that is. We don't have to connect to the database. We don't have to parse each individual value, then add them as parameters to a query. We did this in 6 lines. This will connect to the database and insert a new drink document with the values from our form. So our code is so much cleaner, so much less work. You just have to be careful of the characters. Yesterday I had people getting errors because they used equal signs here instead, or they used semicolons instead of commas. So colons after each attribute name and commas at the end with no comma after your last value. So we're actually going to chain 2 functions together. We'll make one call. We'll start with drink.create. This will attempt to insert a new document into the drinks collection. And it's going to return one of 2 things. What are the 2 possibilities that will happen as a result of this function? Yep, or you got it. And the error will be the first parameter by convention. So now we're just going to check, did we get an error or did we get a successful drink object? If we got an error, we'll log it and we'll redirect to the error page. If not, we'll redirect to the drinks page. So right here on line 42, in between that bracket, I'm going to put in a comma. Actually, oops, I want my callback function. Error is always the first parameter. So there's no round bracket here. My round bracket that ends my create happens here. So we're passing in first our object and then second our callback function. So if we have an error, we'll log it. And then we will load the error EJS file that the Express generator builds for us. And we'll pass a message to that view. If we have no error, we'll redirect to the main drinks page. So localhost 3000/drinks. So we've only written about 1/3 of the code we would have to write in PHP, and our syntax is much easier. We don't have to deal with brackets and quotes. So now once you have your code, your post code, you can go back to your browser, try and add a drink. Let's see what happens. Anybody have a drink we should add? It's got to be one of these three kinds. It's all we've got. Sorry? Okay. Guys? Okay, percentage. Okay. Okay. So our post took our request values, added a new document, saved that to MongoDB, and brought us back here. Now I want to just show, here, I'll put the code back up for a minute, if anybody's having an issue. We haven't really talked about the validation yet. I wanted to see if we could get this to save, but then we need to deal with the validation. It's saved, but I filled out my form correctly, right? I put a numeric value in for the size and percentage, and I completed all of the inputs on the form. What happens if I try and add a drink? So let's say I do this. I have two text inputs, left the name blank. Oh, okay. Well, it did load an error. I guess I have to pass it the error object. But we're also logging the error. So notice what happened. So cast to number failed. Where are these validation errors coming from? So it says ABC is an invalid data type, cast to a number. And also it said, please enter a name. Where are those messages coming from?
Is it from the drink model?
You got it. So our drink model, our class, right, we set out data types and that fields were required. So our model is preventing us from saving bad data. Now, we should also be validating for the proper data on our front end. We don't want to rely on error handling in the model. We should be checking in our user interface. So on name, I'm going to add required. Drink type, we don't have to because there's no default option. It's impossible not to save a drink type. But our size needs required. It needs type equals number. And it needs a minimum of 0. Can't be a negative alcohol percentage. Sorry, a negative size. And the same with our alcohol percentage. It's required. It's numeric. And it can't be a negative. So we actually want our validation both in our user interface as well as in the model. If I go back and fill out my form again, my HTML5 validator should prevent me from putting in any bad data. So all my fields are now required. I can't type in text. I can't put in numbers below 0. So we've actually validated these rules in two places, both in our form itself as well as in the model. Why do we want to have them validated in both places? Like, it seems a little bit unnecessary to validate them in the model considering the users have no way to submit this form with invalid data. Why would we still want to also have not only these validations, but why do we want to have these validations in our model anyway? There's two reasons. Well, at least two reasons. Scare? Okay, yep. That's possible. Any other reasons why we want to make sure we're still validating in our model in addition to on our pages? So injection is one I wasn't thinking of, but you're right. What happens if a user turns off JavaScript on their device? Will the front end validations necessarily work? Maybe not. There's one other reason, and this comes to something that we maybe talked a bit about. Maybe we want to turn our application, we want to use our model to build an API. So maybe we want to let our suppliers, our drink manufacturers, when they come out with a new product, we want them to be able to send us that product and have it go directly into our database. So we would set up an API method to save a new drink. There is no user interface, right? There's no web page. They just send us a JSON file. Well, if that JSON drink has to match our schema here. We need to make sure when they send us a JSON document that all of the rules are followed. So we might reuse this for exchanging data between our application and another one where there is no front-end user interface. So just putting validation in the front-end user interface won't make sure we get good data from another application. So we want to have our validation rules in both places. Our model should have it, and our front-end interface should have the same validation. Okay, so I think our add drink is pretty much done. We can add, we can see that our data shows up here. We can't add any bad data because we're doing double checking. Our front end's validated, our model's validating for good data as well. Okay, so part one of this is complete for today. Does anybody have any questions so far about how we're doing create? Well, let's take a break here for 10 minutes. When we come back, we're going to add the delete function. Delete is pretty simple because we don't have to build a page for it. We just need to add a link and a little JavaScript confirmation to idiot-proof our page. And then we'll write the delete code, which is even shorter than this. Then we'll do an edit, update, and then we'll try and get our whole database running on MLab in the cloud. Yeah, I can, if anybody needs it. Yeah, I will do that. Okay, I'll push to Git and we'll take a break here.